There are at least 8 trade deadline moves the New Orleans Saints should heavily consider. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the Saints dealing with a couple of injuries that are going to raise some availability question marks, but could get some young players out on the field. It's time for evaluation over competition for the New Orleans Saints. And we'll kick everything off with trade deadline talk. This afternoon's trade deadline is right around the corner, and there are at least 8 deals the New Orleans Saints should consider when it comes to being sellers. We got all that coming up for you on today's show. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time, being here with us this time, making us your first listen, and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $300 in bonus bets if you simply win your first $5 bet. So head over to FanDuel.com to get started today. There are at least 8 potential deals that the New Orleans Saints should consider before this afternoon's 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time trade deadline. Now, I am walking on the precipice of danger here doing this show for Tuesday morning, knowing that the trade deadline is mere hours away. So there is a chance that by the time that you're watching or listening to this, some deal has been made, although I'd be a little bit surprised. This is one of those situations where the Saints tend to play things maybe a little bit more steadfast than is necessary in terms of not wanting to give up talent, not wanting to make deals, or being very adamant about what the return value should be for these players. That's not a New Orleans Saints issue. That is an NFL issue. Everyone overvalues their own scouting. So when it comes down to these players that I'm going to name and the potential returns that the Saints should look to get for them, what I want to be clear about is that there's nothing wrong with these players. In order to be tradable, you have to have value. In order to be tradable, you have to be able to bring something to the table. You have to be able to contribute. Each one of these players absolutely does that to some extent, which is what makes them dealable, which makes them trade assets at this time in the year. Let's start off with the biggest name that could potentially be moved, and that's wide receiver Chris Olave. I don't know that this move is going to happen. Everything points to the idea of the Saints and Chris Olave actually trying to work out an extension together rather than a potential move, and that's something that makes sense, right? The Saints probably want to try to get him locked down on a contract before that 5th-year option, potentially bring in another wide receiver in the offseason to work with him, maybe give Devaughn Vele some opportunities. I don't know. But there are some chances here for the Saints to get a long-term deal done with Chris Olave. That seems like that is the preference for the team as opposed to trading the player away. But if the right offer shows up, obviously there should be a price on just about every player outside of maybe a couple of veterans and certainly this year's rookie class or whatever it is, the player-wise that Kellen Moore and defensive coordinator Brandon Staley brought in their vision of what this roster and offense look like or team looks like, as opposed to sort of those that have been inherited from previous coaching staffs. Chris Olave, very, very talented, but does fall under the inherited from previous coaching staff category that could lead to a willingness to move him, but it doesn't feel like that's necessarily something the Saints are in a rush for, which I think is wise. But if you get an offer that's like a 2nd-round pick, along with an early day 3 pick, a 2 and a 5, for instance, that has become one of the more popular wide receiver stock trades out there. That would be probably enough to at least get the New Orleans Saints considering the idea for a move. But overall, I don't know that's necessarily one that they need to make, but certainly one that they can be forced to consider. Another guy that is at that wide receiver position that a lot of folks have pointed to is Rashid Shaheed, New Orleans Saints wide receiver, who is in the final year of his contract at 27 years old. He could be a guy that a lot of teams look for that might be able to be had for a little bit of a cheaper price than Chris Olave because of the not having another year on his contract, right? You're effectively getting this guy for 8 games, and then you'd have to try to re-sign him. Whereas at least with Chris Olave, you get the 5th-year option. That makes Olave maybe a little bit more desirable from a team building standpoint and an acquisitions standpoint. So for Shaheed, I think you're probably looking at a 4th-round pick. And I think a lot of people have in their minds that they could potentially get that they need to get a 3rd-round pick because Rashid Shaheed could net the team a 3rd-round compensatory selection on the market. There's no guaranteeing that. And so getting a 4th-round pick that effectively helps you recoup what you spent on Devaughn Vele feels very that feels like a good move for New Orleans, and certainly could be something to help this team out in its future. How about Carl Granderson, who could probably net a late day 2 selection just by virtue of being an edge rusher? Again, somebody that can contribute for you. The Saints are going to have to go into the edge rusher pool next season anyway. There's the potential for Cam Jordan's career to come to a close here in the next couple of seasons. You probably want to be ready for that with another young guy there. Carl Granderson has been good for this team, but has gone back to having sort of that mid-season slump. And so maybe his trade value might pull more like a 4th or a 5th-round selection. But if you can get a day 2 pick for a premium position at edge rusher, that feels like a good enough situation to at least consider a move. Would you want to lose Carl Granderson? Probably not if you're the Saints, but what could you do with that selection? Obviously, everybody values the unknown pretty highly in the NFL. Linebacker Pete Werner, a day 3 selection that you could probably get for him. Danny Stutsman actually has more tackles than Pete Werner has, despite having played less snaps than Pete Werner has. Shout out to my guy Trizzy Trace for that stat. But it is a piece that the Saints should be looking at, is what their future looks like at linebacker, and is Pete Werner a part of their long-term plan? If he's not, as one of those pieces that was inherited from a previous coaching staff, there's a chance to potentially recoup some draft capital there and add to your ledger. Alvin Kamara is always a really interesting conversation. He's a prized possession in terms of the value that he brings to the locker room. This year, it's been up and down on the field, certainly up early on in the year, but a little bit lower, despite the fact that the Saints have faced the fewest light boxes in the NFL, the most light boxes in the NFL so far, and have faced the 2nd fewest stacked boxes in the NFL so far. And so with all of that, do you potentially look at moving a guy like Alvin Kamara, who doesn't want to be traded? That could be the kind of wrench in the equation there. The fact that he doesn't want to be traded might actually drop his price quite a bit. So if you can get day 3 something there, that's probably good value for you when it comes to a 30-plus-year-old running back, or a running back that's about to be 31. But I don't think the Saints are going to be in any hurry moving off of Alvin Kamara because of what he provides to the locker room, which, yes, does have some value. One of the other big names, not necessarily big names, but one of the other popular names that's popped up here recently that could get you quite a bit of draft capital back could be right guard Cesar Ruiz. I know that fans feel a certain way about Cesar Ruiz, but he's one of the better guards in the NFL. Remember what guard play around the NFL looks like. I encourage you to go and look at the landscape of the position around the entire NFL before simply making a judgment on one player in a vacuum. But if you can get a late day 2 or early day 3 selection from him, a team like the Seattle Seahawks certainly stands out. A day 3 selection of Dylan Radins, as well as a day 3 selection for Isaac Yiadom, could be interesting and enticing there as well, just to add to kind of stockpile a bit of those draft picks, which the Saints only have 5, potentially 6, depending upon Isaac Yiadom's snap count throughout the rest of the season, particularly on defense. And so just being able to add some more of those selections at least gives you some of those pieces that you can utilize for some mobility within the draft. Right now, the Saints would effectively have to stick and pick 5 times in order to really make that draft class of value, unless they wanted to trade some of their 2027 draft capital, which I highly recommend not doing. Multi-year process here, the rebuild for New Orleans. I said at least 8. That was already 8. Well, here's a 9th. How about Brandon Cooks? Day 3 selection. The guy signed with a very, very different understanding of what this team was going to be and the situation he was walking in on. A little bit of respect towards him could potentially effectively put him in a situation where he could land elsewhere to continue kind of competing towards the tail end of his career, the twilight of his career. So that's 9 trades right there that the Saints could potentially consider. And there are certainly more. Feel free to let me know some of your thoughts as well. Would you make any of these moves? And what moves did I not think of in terms of players the Saints could look to shop before just a few hours from now with the trade deadline? All right, coming up next, the New Orleans Saints have entered the evaluation season much earlier than they have in the past, and that might actually be exactly what they need. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Built. Nobody likes paying rent, but if you must, you might as well get something for it. That's where Built comes in. Built is changing the game by turning your rent payment into real rewards that you can actually use. I've used Built before, absolutely love it. I loved it with Built. It finally makes rent work for you. You're earning points every month on something that you already pay. You're able to check out other things too in terms of grabbing food from your local restaurants or even heading to the gym. You're earning reward points all the way throughout. They have made everyday life feel a little bit more rewarding, from your neighborhood to your travel plans. Turn your rent into rewards and start earning points around your neighborhood by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. That's joinbilt.com/lockedonnfl. And make sure you use that link so that they know that we sent you. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints have made an early foray and an arrival into what I like to call evaluation season. We've embarked upon this journey together over the course of the past couple of years now, but typically a lot later on in the season. When we talk about evaluation season, what I mean is getting a look at the players that are a part of your future and are not a part of your future, and starting to get a real understanding of what that looks like. That includes getting a look at some of the young players and young talents that you have. We've talked about Danny Stutsman already in today's episode. The Saints obviously have gotten extended looks at several other players as well. Offensive lineman Kelvin Banks Jr., cornerback Quincy Riley. They're getting the extended look now through the remaining 8 games of the season, presumably with quarterback Tyler Shuck. And so continuing to get a look at these players and these young players does make a lot of sense for New Orleans. And to an extent, it's almost more important than competing at this point, right? The more games the Saints win throughout the rest of this season, the worse their draft position gets. That doesn't mean that they should be thinking about tanking. They obviously have to go out there and compete. They have veterans on this team. They owe that to these players who work their tails off every week to go out there and play in a game, regardless of what the result of that game is. So nothing disrespectful should be done when it comes to trying to tank or trying to improve your draft process or anything like that. But there is something about getting a look at the young players that you have and just kind of swallowing the pill that could potentially come with that. Getting more opportunities with Danny Stutsman out on the field feels like something that could be beneficial for New Orleans. How much longer does Demario Davis have? How much longer is Pete Werner with this team? And the Saints, of course, have other young linebackers as well that they could potentially be getting a look at. Jalen Ford, who was who was in a recent draft class. Isaiah Stallbird, who's been really, really impressive already so far this season, not just as a special teamer, but now is earning a larger role over on the defensive side of the football. Have you really gotten a look at guys like Jordan Howden, as well as Rajon Wright, and some of these other kind of what I would call young veterans that are on your roster that you could be getting a look at to figure out what it is that they can do for you? How about utilizing Devin Neal a bit more, right? Just 3 carries after no carries in his first game as, he wasn't a starter, but, as a player getting a healthy amount of snaps for the team following Kendre Miller's injury just a couple of weeks ago in Chicago. And then just 3 carries in this past game up against the Los Angeles Rams, playing a little bit more of a protection role and kind of serving as a giveaway for opposing defenses throughout. When number 24 is on the field, the Saints really like him in pass protection. They rarely give him the ball. Kind of tells you what it is that the offense is doing. It's like Keith Kirkwood and Adam Prentice and Lynn Bowden all over again, right? Something that sort of signifies to the team, oh, this player's on. Now we know what it is that they're going to do. Now, the Saints could be, and Kellen Moore could be setting up a bit of a tendency in order to break that tendency. We saw that earlier on in the season with the big touchdown pass and how the Saints utilized those heavier tight end sets and multi-tight end sets, and how they ended up flipping that into this major play at a later point with a connection between Spencer Rattler and Rashid Shaheed. But as of right now, it doesn't feel like it's about building tendencies more than it is about just the simple necessity. The Saints clearly trust Devin Neal in pass protection more than the rest of their running back room so far, at least the active running back room that's been there, which has really only been Alvin Kamara thus far. And we know that pass protection hasn't always been, the gold star for him. It's been what he can do in space, which is not how he's been utilized so far this season. He had one screen pass thrown his way on a swing off of a play action in this game up against the Rams. And then after that, we thought, oh, maybe the screen pass is going to make a return for the running back. And then never again did we see it. And some of that comes down probably to game situation and all these other things we have to take into consideration. But for the most part, the Saints have kind of been a telltale sign with their backfield about what it is that they're intending to do over on the offensive side, which is interesting because that's not the typical Kellen Moore approach. Kellen Moore has always been very good at disguising what it is that he wants to do on offense and setting up tendencies and breaking those tendencies. And to an extent, you have to wonder why all of a sudden that's changed. Well, a good portion of it might be that this is exactly what it is that the Saints are doing. They're trying to get a look at the basics of what it is that they have on this team, offense and defense. The Saints, I mentioned earlier, have faced light boxes more than any other team in the NFL. That's according to Next Gen Stats, over 53% of the time. Light boxes meaning fewer than 8 players in the box, right? So you're not talking about, a stacked box of having more than just your typical front 7, right? That's kind of the idea. And despite that, the Saints are one of the worst teams in yards before contact so far in the run game and have been a top 13 team, probably still with a lot of holdover from the earlier portions of the season in terms of yards after contact. Now, these metrics don't tell the whole story about where things are for the New Orleans Saints, but it does give you a pretty good indication that they are struggling in certain areas. And so does it behoove New Orleans to get a look at some of their younger offensive linemen to see if Dylan Radins is the guy that they want to keep around beyond this season, to see where it is that a Torres Ellis-Simpkins might be able to help them out, to get a look at Xavier Truss, who they picked up off of waivers, but hasn't been active really since he joined the team for the most part, right? They're going to get a look at Asim Richards more than likely going into next week's game again. And so getting a look at those players in the trenches, on the offensive line, finding opportunities to get a look at Christian Boyd over on the defensive line, figuring out what they could do with, a full, not a full season, but now with more than half the season in the books, how much more has Fadil Diggs grown, and can he move to the active roster to get an opportunity on game day? And so I think that there's a lot of these players that should be getting maybe more reps at this point. Or let me not say it that way, because I shouldn't say what the team should do. The team's going to do what the team wants to do, and they've earned that, right? They're NFL coaches. I am not. However, it is something that the Saints can consider. And that would make sense if they did consider. I mean, even down to the Devaughn Vele equation, right? Just getting an opportunity to get a look at him with Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, and maybe playing ahead of Brandon Cooks for a little bit, playing ahead of, other guys that could potentially go out there and contribute. Can you get Devaughn Vele on instead of for 20-ish snaps a game? Can you get him on for 30, 40 snaps a game? Now, I know that the Saints only played 40 offensive snaps last week up against the Rams. I get that. So that limited that. But even if you go beyond that, right? Devaughn Vele's been on this team for the entire season and has been active on game day with the exception of the Seattle Seahawks game, and has 10 targets so far on the year. That's what you gave up a 4th round pick for? I don't think that that's the goal. I don't think that that's the vision in terms of what they had for Devaughn Vele. So can you get that vision out on the field and begin to build a little bit of an understanding or a greater understanding of your roster 1 through 53 on the field in terms of the regular season and getting out into regular season game action? I'll mention Audric Estime as well, another big bodied between the tackles thumper of a running back that is unlike anything that the Saints have on their roster at that position. He could be another guy that you elevate and get some playing opportunities as well alongside Alvin Kamara and Devin Neal to give him a little bit of run and exposure to the game in your system as well. So I think that this is what the Saints season could be about. Again, I'm not going to say should, but in my opinion, whoops, I'm punching everything. In my opinion, is what the rest of the season could be about for New Orleans, which is figuring out what they've got and figuring out what they don't necessarily need to retain going into next year and to the next offseason, which should be a pretty active season when it comes to flipping the coaching staff. Coming up next, there are a couple of built-in opportunities to get a look at some young players here for the New Orleans Saints, but unfortunately, it's all due to injury. I got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, our official sports betting partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And the NBA is back, which means that there's no better way to get in on that action than with FanDuel, who's also the official sports betting partner of the NBA themselves. So even if you miss the start of a game or you just want to ride the hot hand for a second, FanDuel has the live bets that help you do that. You can bet on everything from who scores next to fourth quarter comebacks. You can even put together a bunch of your favorite live game parlays or favorite live game bets into a parlay with a chance at an even larger payout. It keeps every game more exciting, especially when it's your favorite team that's making that late push, which, well, it is the Pelicans after all. Right now, FanDuel is also giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when you win your first $5 bet. That's all you got to do. Win your first $5 bet, $300 in bonus bets. Head over to FanDuel.com to get started today with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Speaking of evaluation season, the New Orleans Saints are going to have a couple of injuries that might open up opportunities for other players to get some exposure and some evaluation. We saw two players carted off of the field after being checked out in the injury tent late in the game, the loss to the Los Angeles Rams, first of which was tight end Jack Stoll, who was carted off. And then very soon right after that was offensive lineman starting right tackle Taliese Fuaga, both of which were carted off in quick succession with one another after being looked at. What's important to highlight here is that there's always sort of been some conversation around Taliese Fuaga and knee injuries, back injuries, things like that. That's not what this is. This isn't relevant to that injury or that sort of bout that Taliese deals with on a weekly basis and manages on a weekly basis. This is more, or we assume on a weekly basis. This is a different injury. These are both high ankle injuries. I assume high ankle sprains. According to head coach Kellen Moore, they will be week to week and that it might be tough for them both to be available going into the game up against the Carolina Panthers week 10 here this weekend in Charlotte. So that's going to open up opportunities potentially for two players to be able to get a little bit more run and a little bit more action on the field. The first of which, starting on the offensive line, is Asim Richards. Asim Richards has already seen some opportunities already so far this season when Taliese was dealing with some injuries earlier on in the year. And so Asim Richards, somebody that the Saints ended up acquiring this offseason in an offseason move with the Dallas Cowboys. He ends up being a player that could get some opportunities here for New Orleans as the starting right tackle in the matchup. So that will be a big spot to watch in this game. The Carolina Panthers are coming off of a huge win against the Green Bay Packers this past weekend. And so there's going to be a lot of confidence and all those other things that are coming from that. And so seeing how they maybe go to attack the Saints offensive line, which has had its ups and its downs to it's to the fullest extent of the conversation so far this season, they'll probably look at Asim Richards as a potential sort of, I'm going to use air quotes here, weak link, right? Somebody that doesn't have as much exposure as the other guys, someone's not a part of the offense, the starting offensive line, all those other bits. But 9 pressures surrendered so far this season, 0 of which have been sacks over the course of his 77 pass blocking snaps, according to Pro Football Focus. 8 hurries, only 1 hit on the quarterback. That was back in Seattle, a game that he ended up, the one game, the last and only game that he ended up as a starter for New Orleans. Otherwise, he saw 26 snaps up against Arizona at right tackle, and then saw a couple of snaps at left tackle on a couple of different occasions over the course of the past few games, and obviously saw some snaps in Taliese Fuaga's place this past week as well. So there will be some things there to kind of keep an eye out on and watch out for, but that's definitely a position where the Saints are going to get a little bit of an identity check on Asim Richards and how he potentially fits in with their offensive line, I assume, throughout the practice week. I think when it comes to Taliese Fuaga, he's such a big part of what your future is going to be, that he is one of those players you already know you want to be a long-term vision guy, that there's no need to rush him back on an ankle injury that could potentially worsen. Similarly, Jack Stoll, tight end, left with that ankle injury. This is going to do a couple different things. Obviously, it's going to continue the workload for Juwan Johnson. It's going to up the workload probably for tight end Foster Moreau, but then also opens the door for the Saints to potentially get a look at a tight end that they brought in just a couple of weeks ago that they picked up off of waivers following the Chicago Bears game in Zaire Mitchell-Paden. Now, this is a 6'5", 260-pound, just behemoth of a tight end. I was going to say a linebacker, of a tight end. And he's got, I think it's 1 catch for 3 yards in his career, but his big body and his ability as a blocker is what it is that sold the Saints on him in terms of going to go and get him. And so Jack Stoll, who is a bit more of a run blocker or pass protector for this team at tight end than he is a pass catcher, has a pretty natural role that a guy like Zaire Mitchell-Paden could potentially fit into. And so this is another player that you're going to get an opportunity, if you're the Saints, to probably get a bit of a look at. He's been inactive over the course of the past few games since he joined the team. No surprise there, considering that he joined late. But if you want a third tight end active, you can obviously bring in Muliki Mataval, somebody that you can bring back to the active roster via signing if you want to. You can also elevate Trayton Welsh if you want to go that route as well, both of which can contribute in that area. But considering the skill set of a guy like Mitchell-Paden and the skill set of a guy like Stoll, it feels like a pretty good fit, even if it's just specific roles or specific packages that you have for him to be able to fit in for you. So another young player that could potentially see a little bit of exposure for the New Orleans Saints. We'll see throughout the week what the injury updates for these two players are. All right, coming up in tomorrow's episode, obviously we'll react to anything that the Saints do or don't do, which would be detrimental, in my opinion, at the trade deadline. And of course, continuing to take a look at the performances so far for this New Orleans Saints team. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. If you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know what family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.